After 4 glasses of wine and all that matzah, you showed up. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Good morning, everyone. Shabbat shalom. How was Seder's last night? Everyone enjoy? We had a great one too. It was wonderful. Hag Sameach. You're married Seder.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. All right. Good morning. Oops. How you doing? How's your father? It's wonderful. Yeah. All right, as long as he's getting better. Okay, good. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, we
You
saw
want
it.
to share that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, good morning. Shabbat shalom. Hag Sameach. A happy, healthy Pesach to everybody. Good to see you all. How was Seder's last night? You made it out of Egypt. You made it across the Red Sea. It's one. Apparently, some of our number haven't made it out yet, so it's wonderful. Well, welcome. It's good to have you here. Following our learning together, there's prayers this morning, a service. This no particular simcha, just the yontif. So it's a full hallel and a lot of Torah reading, and then a sort of sparse kiddush. And then this week the synagogue is open, but sort of on hiatus. Schools are out, and everybody's taking some time with their families. Next week, the Tamarim service on Friday night, a beautiful Sephardic rendition of the prayer service. And then Shabbos morning is the adult bar and bat mitzvah. We have 8 people, including Brian, who's always here. Where's Brian? Brian's not here today? Brian is going to be one of the bar mitzvahs. A lovely, lovely ceremony, really moving ceremony. And we'll also have the Yizkor prayers at the end of the service. That's next Saturday morning. And we will have Torah study, like usual. Like always. And the Psalms class will be Tuesday night. And the choir will be singing the Psalms, right? Is that the idea? Yes, the choir will be. It's all one system. Okay. Good. So thank you for getting up this morning and coming. We're going to learn this morning. I have a particular idea I want to share. I love Pesach. I was born on Pesach, so my father will tell you to his utter frustration that years and years he was given bottles of whiskey from his employers as a Christmas present, and he saved them all, hoping that when his kid would be born, that would be what they would serve at the bris. And I was born Erev Pesach, so the bris was on Pesach, and he couldn't use any of it, right? He had to go out and buy Schlivovitz and macaroons. Yeah, it's awful. It's terrible. Pesach in my family owned a bakery. Dad owned a shop. Mom and Dad owned a shop. So, if you imagine that your father's the king of chumetz, right? What Pesach is like, right? So it was always very special. I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you prepared the house, but you'd wake up, when I was a kid, you'd wake up Pesach morning and the house was different. I mean, the dishes were different and the place smelled different, and it was a completely different world. And for the week, Pop was home. Because we had the only week of the year I had my father home, and it was wonderful. And my mom was home. It was a very special time, and I still like it. I don't even. The preparations are arduous if you do it right, but I think it's worthwhile once a year cleaning out the refrigerator and cleaning the stove and cleaning the kitchen, and you find all sorts of things. I found Jimmy Hoffa in the back of my fridge. I found the 18 minutes of Nixon's tape. I found the full Mueller report in the back. It was there. I didn't know it was there. It was among all the stuff that had been rotting in the back of the fridge. And then, the gathering, it's a beautiful holiday. And we had a wonderful Seder last night. We had my kids and their spouses, which was just special. First time we've ever done that. But there's a question that's always asked at my Seder, and an issue that's always raised. And because I'm a rabbi, I'm really good at eluding it. But this morning, I think we ought to take it on full, which is this. Brian, Mazel Tov. We do a mazel tov a few minutes ago. It's our bar mitzvah boy. Come on in, come on in. Here's the issue. The burden of the Seder, the burden of the Haggadah, the purpose, the lesson of the Haggadah is to teach us about a God of history. Hi, oy vey, what happened? Did you kick him? You kicked him? Is that what happened? Oy, he probably deserved it. It's okay. It's a newlywed. The whole story of the Haggadah, of the Seder, is there is a God of history. And the story we told last night is that God reached into history, rescues his people with signs and wonders, destroys the Pharaoh, takes us across the Red Sea, destroys evil with plagues. It's a great story. It's a great story. The problem is, it's hard to believe if you're us. And I think it's hard to believe for three principal reasons, right? Number one, we don't read history that way. At least since the Enlightenment, we read history as the product of human choices that are affected by social and economic and political and technological and scientific and philosophical forces, but that history is shaped by human forces, not by divine forces. I mean, if I ask you, what are the causes of the Civil War or the First World War? Why did the Soviet Union fall? You wouldn't say it was God's will. You would say the Soviet Union fell because of economic miscalculations and strategic miscalculations. You might even be more flowery and poetic about it and say that because tyranny can't last forever. But you wouldn't say it was God, at least today, we wouldn't say it was God's will. Okay? Number two, whenever that phrase is used in regard to things that we see in the world, it seems strange. You know, there's a hurricane in Florida and some preacher says it's God's will. He's punishing the evil people of South Florida. What? No, nothing happened to their houses, right? Right? Their roofs didn't get blown off. You know, or if a politician or a political leader says something like, you know, we won this election because it was God's will. It seems triumphalist and tribal and foolish. It's almost as bad as when they ask the athlete right after the game, you know, Lou, why did you win the game? You were down by 7 in the fourth quarter, and somehow you pulled it out. And he says, all glory to God. It was God's will. Yeah, I'm sure God had his team and the points. You know, that's, you know, I mean, come on. It is like God's running the universe, but, you know, it takes time to lay a bet on the Patriots. You know, because Bill Belichick is such a righteous man, you know, and now we know Robert Kraft as well. You know, a generous man, Jewish community. It doesn't sound honest. I mean, it sounds triumphalist and self-serving. And then the third reason, which is the one that always comes up in my Seder table, is we in our moment of history have experienced the greatest cataclysm in all of Jewish history. And if you posit a God of history, you've got to answer the question, well, why didn't God stop the Holocaust? Why didn't God rescue the Jews of the Holocaust? Where was your God of history then? Did he not care? Was this his will? Was this God's will? Did we deserve it? That would be God's will, right? So I can tell the Seder story and enjoy the holiday, but at the back of my mind is this question, is how do I reconcile myself with this belief if it doesn't fit the world that I live in? It doesn't fit my understanding of how history works, and it doesn't fit my experiences. Now, here's what I want to suggest. We're not the first generation to ask this question. In fact, the rabbis who put together our Seder, the very same rabbis who wrote the Haggadah, the Exodus takes place, 1200 BCE, and the Bible says, you will tell your child in that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went out of Egypt. But the Seder and the Haggadah were put together by the rabbis of the first century after the destruction of the temple. It was a way of replacing the rite of the Passover sacrifice of the temple with something that we could do here in Encino. That's how our Seder came to be. It was written by the rabbis of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. The Haggadah is a product of that rabbinic civilization. And at the core of rabbinic civilization is the same catastrophe. The temple was destroyed. And in the eyes of a Jew of the 1st century, the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem was every bit as cataclysmic as the Holocaust is to us. And then, a generation later, they revolted again against Rome, because Jews never learn, right? And the Romans imposed terrible restrictions and terrible oppression on Palestine, on Israel, murdering many of the great rabbis. And the rabbis are writing the Haggadah in the shadow of this. So I want to make the following suggestion. It's a crazy suggestion, but a suggestion, which is that the burden of the Haggadah is not only to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt in fulfillment of the mitzvah of the Torah. The real burden of the Haggadah, the real purpose of the Haggadah, is to figure out how do I relate to the Bible's God of history when I don't live in that world anymore? How do I live with a God of history when the God of history doesn't seem to be apparent in my own experience? That's the real purpose of the Haggadah. And the Haggadah is going to give us, in quiet ways, because it realizes not everybody's ready to hear this, but in some quiet ways, some hints about where to go with that question. And I want to take a look at those together today. And then I want to switch from the Haggadah to contemporary times and look at 3 modern thinkers who have asked the same question and offered interpretations of Pesach as a way of understanding how do you live with a God of history if the God of history seems to be hidden in our time. That's going to be our study today, okay? So far so good? Everybody okay? Yes. So let's start beginning. So here's the burden of the Haggadah. You said this last night. V'hisha amda lavatenu v'lanu shelo achad bilvad amar aleinu l'chalotenu ela shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu l'chalotenu v'kodesh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam. There's a good song to this. It was God's promise of redemption that stood for our ancestors and for us. It is not, since it was not only one that stood against us to destroy us, not just Pharaoh, but rather in every generation they stand against us to destroy us. V'kodesh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam, and God saves us from them. God rescues us. That's the faith of the Haggadah. And in case you miss it, they give you this wonderful statement. It's not by a malach, right? God brought us out of Egypt. Lo al yedei malach, v'lo al yedei seraph, v'lo al yedei shliach, ela kodesh baruch hu b'chvod ba'atzmo. God brought us out of Egypt not by an angel. There was no agency here. God didn't send a messenger to do this. This was not indirect. This was direct divine intervention into history. This is the burden. This is the story of the Haggadah, not by an angel or a seraph or a messenger, but God and God alone redeemed us. So if God and God alone redeemed us, the rabbis are asking, what do we do now? How do we understand that God now? Let's take a look at what the rabbis do with catastrophe, okay? So the greatest catastrophe in rabbinic literature, believe it or not, is not the destruction of the Holy Temple. I don't know what that sound is. I don't know what they're doing outside. It's not the destruction of the temple. It's actually the destruction of the rabbis themselves. And the most important one is Rabbi Akiva. In fact, if you want to make an interesting case, if you really have a broad mind, you can understand the development of Western civilization as the responses to 3 great moments of martyrdom. Right? The martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva, the martyrdom of Jesus of Nazareth, and the martyrdom of Socrates. Right? The martyrdom of Socrates gives us the rise of Western political and ethical philosophy. The martyrdom of Jesus of Nazareth gives the rise of Christianity. And the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva gives us rabbinic Judaism. So here's the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva supported the Bar Kokhba revolt. And after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans made it illegal to teach Torah in Israel, according to the Talmud. So, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, once the wicked Roman government issued a decree forbidding Jews to study and practice Torah. But Rabbi Akiva couldn't live with that, so he went on teaching Torah in public, defying the government, the first refusnik, okay? So what happened? He was arrested and thrown into prison. And then it was taken out to be executed for this crime, and the Romans wanted to do it in a big public way. The Romans, when they killed people, these people knew how to kill people, right? So they take him out to the forum, to the arena, and they're going to torture him to death in front of the community as a political act. As he was taken out to be executed, it was time for the recital of the Shema. It was evening time. The sun was going down. As the executioners were combing his flesh with iron combs, they were torturing him to death, he was smiling. He was lovingly making himself ready to accept upon himself the yoke of heaven's kingship. He's lovingly, Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, he's saying the Shema. He's getting ready to say the Shema. And now the rabbis create this remarkable scene. His students are sitting in the arena, and they see their teacher being tortured to death, but instead of screaming in agony, he's smiling and praying. And so they ask him, Moreno, Ad Kan? Even now? Even under these circumstances? Even now you attach yourself loyally to God? Even now you haven't lost faith? Even now you are fully at one with your God? And he replies, only in the rabbinic imagination can a man offer a class while he's being tortured to death, right? So the arena of death becomes a classroom of life. You see this? This is great. And he says, all my days I've been troubled by the verse, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you will love the Lord your God, b'chol levavcha, with your heart, u'b'chol nafshecha, with your soul, u'b'chol meodecha, with your might. So I said, I interpreted it, even if he takes your soul. But I asked, when shall I have occasion to fulfill this precept? If one of the core mitzvot of the tradition is to love God with all of your life force, your nefesh, when would I ever have a chance to fulfill this mitzvah? I'm now given the chance to fulfill the mitzvah. This is it. I'm delighted. He prolonged the Shema. He's, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And when he said the word Echad, he dies. He dies. So we have this remarkable scene where the rabbis imagine the death of Akiba. And by the way, if you read the Kryto, which is the death of Socrates, in many ways it's the same thing. He's carrying on a lesson, a shiur, as he's being killed, as he's dying. Here, Akiba, as he's dying, is giving a lesson, right? So now, what happens next? This is the best part. What happens next? The greatest rabbi in the world, the greatest rabbi who ever lived, the greatest embodiment of Torah, the most realized soul in all of Jewish history. And he dies this way, right? A divine voice proclaims, happy are you, Akiba, that your soul departed with the word Echad. You died as you lived, in faithfulness to God. But that's not enough. You see, that would be the end of the story if we were a certain kind of faith, right? That's enough. God says, Ashrei, happy. But Jews don't live with this stuff well, right? Jews always have a question. Last night, you asked the youngest person in the room to ask a question. I think that's a remarkable religious gesture. The first thing a kid says when he's articulate is to ask a question. So what's the question? The question is put into the mouth not of Jews, but of the angels of heaven, who are pure, right? Come in. The angels of heaven say, Zo Torah v'zo schara. They protest to God. This is Torah. This is learning. This is piety. This is oneness with God. And this is what you let happen to him? Now, we can translate that into more vernacular. What kind of universe are you running here? What kind of universe? You allow a man as pure and as given to light, to spirituality as Rabbi Akiba. This is how you let him die? What the hell is wrong with you? They're asking the same question we asked at the Seder last night. Where is the God of history? Where is the God of power? Where are the plagues? Where is the where are the frogs and the lightning and where? Save him. Why don't you save him? Zo Torah v'zo schara. And it's wonderful because they put that accusation in the mouth of the angels. Because the angels are always the ones singing Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. God is so great, God is so great, God is so great. But in the Jewish imagination, every now and again the angels say, wait, hello. Hello? Zotarah. He should have been one of those who died by thy hand, according to the Psalms. The righteous die by God's hand gently. God replied, their portion is in life. I'll come back to that, right? Just then, another divine voice goes out and proclaims, happy are you, Akiba, destined as you are for life in the world to come. And then the last line of the story is, on that day Rabbi Akiba died, Rabbi Yehuda was born. Now, what do you have here? You have a story with 4 endings. Why do you have a story with 4? When do you tell a story with 4 endings?
You're a Jew.
Yes, that's true. Right. All right. When do you we have any more sheets? We have any more of the sheets?
The sheet's right on
If you haven't gotten a sheet, take one. Jerry didn't get one there. Okay.
right over there.
When do you tell a story with 4 endings? Why 4 endings to the story? Why not just one? Because you don't like any of them, right? There's movies like this, right, where the guy will shoot a movie and they'll get reviewed badly and they'll reshoot it and they'll director's cut, which is a way of saying, we don't like the way it ended, we're going to do it differently, right? That's how I would end Game of Thrones, by the way. I would show Game of Thrones every day the last week with a different ending. Different kings, right. And you can just tune in any day, depending on what you want to hear, right? Look at the different endings to this, right? So Rabbi Akiba is killed. That's an historical fact, right? But we hear the endings, right? So number 1, what's the first ending? God says, or the divine voice says, happy are you, Akiba, your soul departed with the word Echad. How is that an ending? What?
Religious.
What meaning what? Interpret it.
He adhered to all of God's precepts and he died
Right.
one with God.
He died as he lived, one with God. He died as he lived, one with God. Complete integrity. Remember, Akiba says to his students, I want to fulfill the mitzvah b'chol nafshecha. I want to fulfill the mitzvah b'chol nafshecha. This is my chance to fulfill the mitzvah b'chol nafshecha. And the divine voice saying, you died as you lived, fulfilling mitzvahs. You are immortal in your piety. Not everybody gets to die as they live, right? Most of us live compromised lives. You imagine the scale with your sins on one side and your merits on the other, and if you're lucky, it's not too bad, right? Here's a guy who's all mitzvahs, complete mitzvah life, and he even died fulfilling a mitzvah. All right, that's one way to look at it. What's the next one? What's the next one? So now the angels step in and say, Zot Torah v'zot schara. That's the voice of protest. Where is the God of history if a keeper can die this way? And God answers, how? They say he should have been like Moshe. Moses dies with a kiss. God should have died in his bed with his great-grandchildren around him, right? And God should have kissed him. He should have closed his eyes and slipped away. Why is he dying in this horrid way, right? Zot Torah v'zot schara, right? And the answer is strange. You'd imagine it would say what it's going to say next. What it says next is what you really imagine it's going to say. Another divine voice comes and says, happy you are Akiba, destined for life in the world to come. Right? Rabbi Gelman gave 2 brilliant lectures about this, and I would urge you to go listen to them on the VBS website.
I would too.
No, seriously. They were very good. They were very good. They were very good. So the answer of the world to come is the answer, is an answer, right? I do believe in a God of history, but that God doesn't function anymore to bring justice in our world. That God functions to bring justice in the next world. So I defer the justice, right? Pharaoh got it in this world. But most of us are not going to get it in this world. We're going to get what's coming to us in the next world. The whole idea of the world to come allows us to continue to believe in a God of history, even if we can't see it happening in front of us. That's why the world to come that's why it works, you see? So that's an answer. The other answer is the one where he says their portion is in life, yeah?
Isn't there a story in the Talmud of Moses and the academy where God says, shut up, you, in effect?
Yeah, same phrase, by the way. And same guy.
Silence, this is my decree.
This is my decree. Zot Torah v'zot schara, say the angels, or says Moses.
Yeah.
And God says, that's how I run my universe, shut up. But here they have to confront How do you believe in a God of history? You read the Bible, and there's this God who's doing all this stuff in history, and now I live in a world where the most genuinely pious person can die in the most ignominious way. How do I understand that? So one understanding is what Billy said, that he lives his life as he dies as he lives. There's integrity to his life. Another way is the world to come. Another way is the world to come. And here's a third way. Well, look at the last line. This is very innocuous, but you got to collect Rabbi baseball cards to know why this is important. This is like saying on the day that Mickey Mantle died, right? You know.
Mike Trout was born.
Yeah, Mike Trout was born, right. That's a rabbinic baseball. Rabbi Yehuda is going to be the codifier of the Mishnah. He's going to take Rabbi Akiva's work and go beyond it. So the man dies, but his Torah doesn't die. Right? You can kill the body, but you can't kill his spirit. You can't kill what he's put into the world. The man dies, but his Torah doesn't die, because the people that will expand upon his Torah go on living. The legacy is in the community, and the community that preserves his Torah. Einat Tzibur Met, says the Talmud. The community doesn't die. Right? Now there's one other answer, by the way, and I want you to see this answer because we're going to come back to it in a minute. Look at what they do to his death. I mean, they could have described his death in a very different way, right? They took him out. They tortured him to death. He screamed in agony. His students and friends mourned and grieved. I mean, think about lahavdil, but, think about the Passion of the Christ, right? Which is, yes, this weekend, right? The guy's dying and his mishpacha is standing around the cross crying. I mean, that could have been the scene, right? Lahavdil. It's a different one. But what you have here is really interesting. The rabbis turn his death scene into a classroom. They turn it into a classroom. And it's a classroom about what? About mitzvahs, about how you live a life, about how you live a pious life. Right? That the death becomes subsumed in a halachic structure that says, well, if you want to keep him, if you want to stay alive, you stay alive in the normative world that you sponsor, that you push forward. Now, let's understand that in a different way. Where in the Haggadah do we have these same answers? Where in the Haggadah do we have the same answers? Well, let's take a look, right? Where in the Haggadah do you have the world to come? It's all over the place, right? If you don't know any other place to look for it, look at the very end. What's the last line of the Haggadah? No, yeah, well, Shana Haba Yerushalayim is the last line, and that's purely messianic. That is not a travelogue for El Al, right? That is, it's Yerushalayim HaBnuyah, and during the Seder you open the door to Eliyahu Navi, right? Elijah's the precursor of Messiah. But in case you miss it, the last line of the Haggadah is Ve'ata Kodesh Baruch Hu Ve'shahachat L'malcha Mavis. God comes and destroys death. At the end of the Haggadah, death is destroyed. Right? Adirhu, Yivne Beito Bekarov, Bimhera, Biyameinu Bekarov, El B'nei, B'nei Beitcha Bekarov. Adirhu, the great one, rebuild the temple. These are all purely messianic. So one answer of the rabbis is, I do believe in a God of history, but that God of history will not be made apparent in this world. This world is a world of misery. This world is a world where sometimes injustice wins. This is a world, but wait, it's not over yet. There is another act to history. This is only Act 1. Then comes a short intermission, and Act 2 in history, all the things that you asked for are going to happen because Act 2 is going to resolve all the injustices. Adir Hu, Chad Gadya, opening the door to Eliyahu Navi. That's one of the answers. Push it into the future. Push it into the future, and you will see the God of history that you're looking for. Right? Happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, destined for life in the world to come. Okay? That's one answer. All right, here's a second answer. If you read your Haggadah last night, and this, you have to be a really good reader to see this. The Haggadah does a weird thing. The kid asks the question, "Ma nishtana layla hazeh?" And then we have to give an answer. We actually give the answer 3 different times. One of the times we give the answer, we start this way. Mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu. In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. And you say, wait a minute, we're in Egypt. We're not talking about those days. We're talking about Terach, Abraham and Terach. But the reason why that's there is because, what are they trying to say? That the liberation from Egypt, the liberation was not the biggest liberation. That was a small liberation. I mean, although that's the big story we're going to tell tonight. The real liberation was, yes, a liberation of the mind from its slavery to idolatry. It's a different kind of liberation. So there is a God of history. The God of history doesn't destroy nations. The God of history gives you an opening to find the truth. It's a spiritualization of the story. Steve, can I ask you a big favor? Let's open the door again. This is getting a little warm in here. I know. I think the guy, whatever they were doing outside, stopped doing it. No, they're still doing it. All right, I'll try to scream. Or I can turn the air conditioning on, but you know what? You know what happens? I know you like that. Yeah. Where is the halachic answer? Anyone find it interesting that the question of the Chacham, I forgot to put it on the sheet. What's the question of the wise son? You remember the 4 sons? The 4 sons is a midrash created by the rabbis. All right, tell you what, close that, I'll turn this on. I give up. This is God. There's no God of history, and he doesn't want me teaching. That's what. Let's see if that works. There are 4 times the Torah says you're supposed to tell your kid the story of the Exodus, right? And so the rabbis wonder why 4 times, and they said for 4 different kinds of people, right? The wise or the engaged person, the alienated person, the silent person, and the simple person. Okay. The wise son, what's his question? Ma chokim v'mishpatim. What are all the rules and laws? Right? First of all, that's an odd question to be asking at the table, don't you think? I mean, if you're going to ask that question, ask it 2 weeks before. Ask me what the rules and laws when I need help cleaning the refrigerator. Schmuck, Like, why are you sitting, now that the fridge is clean and the meal is cooked and we're sitting here at the table, now you ask me what the rules are? Like chutz, But what does it mean? It means if I'm looking for the God of history, one of the places I can find him is transformed into the God of halacha. The God of history is mediated by Jewish practice. The way that we adopt the norms and truths of the Torah, that's where the God of history intervenes in history. Okay? So we've had 2 answers now so far, right? One answer is the future answer. 3 answers. One answer is the spiritualized answer, and one answer is the halachic answer. So far, so good? Everybody okay so far? We got this? You following this? Yeah. Breathe. Somebody I'm insecure. Come on. Let's take an excursus. I want to take a digression for a minute. I want to jump to the Hasidic tradition. The Hasidic tradition, of course, begins in the 17th century, 18th century. And the Hasidic tradition does something very interesting to Torah. It internalizes Torah. Everything is about your inner life. This is what the Hasidic tradition was meant to be. What you see today is a little different than that. But this is what it was meant to be. So here are 3 wonderful Hasidic teachings about this, right? So the verse in Exodus, look at the bottom of the page. The verse in Exodus says, a long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under their bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from bondage arose to God, and God heard their moaning. What's interesting about that? Pharaoh enslaves them. Do they cry out? No. Pharaoh makes their work even harder. Do they cry out? Only to Moses, not to God. Pharaoh throws their kids into the Nile. They don't cry out. Why don't they cry out? They only cry out at the end of chapter 2 when Pharaoh dies and the new Pharaoh takes over. They only cry out then. And the question is, why did they wait so long to cry out? And here's the answer. There's 3 answers. First, we'll begin with the Ishbitzer, okay? Meshiloach. Immediately as their cries rose up, salvation began. Till then, they had not had any arousal to cry and pray. All right, what's the worst kind of slavery? It's the slavery of the mind. It's the slave who has internalized his condition as a slave. The slave eventually internalizes his condition as a slave, and he ceases to see it as anything but inevitable and normal. We all do this. We talked about this last week. Culture is what is invisible to us. Cultural patterns of behavior and attitudes become invisible to us. We literally take them for granted because they are given to us and we live within them. It's like we're swimming in them, and we don't have any perspective to see them and say, hey, wait a minute. This occurs in all different kinds of ways, right? I'll give a silly example. When a long time ago, the air in LA was very bad. When I was a kid, the air, you'd sting your eyes when you went out to play, right? But you didn't see it because you lived in it, and it was normal. It was only when you flew into LAX and you saw this big brown cloud over Los Angeles, you said, we breathe that stuff? Oh my God. That just a sense of that which is inevitable, that which is invisible to us. So what happens? When the Israelites are slaves, they don't know they're slaves. They don't realize, or if they know they're slaves, they don't realize that there's anything wrong with that because that's the way it is. That's the way it is. Yes, Andy?
Could it be a resignation and not an acceptance?
Well, I think it's resignation, not an acceptance. I think it's a way of coping with the reality, sure. I mean, you cope with that reality.
I mean, you realize what's going on.
Well, but you don't protest it, you see? Now, could it be, it's comforting just to accept it and say that's what I want. But what happens is it becomes something you advocate. I had a very funny experience once. I once interviewed Phyllis Schlafly. Anybody happen to know who she was? Yes. Right. Right. The UJ was University of Judaism, before it was AJ, used to have a public lecture series. And they had a lecture series, and they asked me to moderate a discussion between Sarah Weddington and Phyllis Schlafly. Sarah Weddington is the law professor who tried Roe Wade. She's a law professor at Texas, a very formidable woman. And Phyllis Schlafly is not. Okay? Phyllis Schlafly was an advocate for traditional female roles. And I got to, and I can't help myself. So I kept asking, I said, Mrs. Schlafly, you don't think that women have a right? No, we're very happy being what we are. I mean, she defended a very, very traditional, non-feminist idea of women, right? While Sarah Weddington was sitting under her chair. I mean, it was, and I just kept probing, saying, and she kept saying, no, this is the way it's supposed to. This is what's supposed to be. Women are supposed to be submissive, and women are. Are you cold now? I'm sorry. So this is the. I'm sorry. It's all Gelman's fault. It's damn it. Yeah. But it's we accept these things. They become part of us, right? Is it a resignation out of frustration? Is it a resignation out of it? There's no way out, right? One of the things that we read at my Seder every year is a section from Martin Luther King's famous letters from the Birmingham jail. King is put in jail because he's inspiring the bus boycott in Birmingham, Alabama. And he's condemned by the Black Ministers Association. In fact, all the ministers' associations. And he gets so angry that he takes a roll of toilet paper from the latrine and he writes this letter. You can get it online. Now, you can buy it, but you can get it online for free. And he writes a letter, especially to his African-American Black ministerial colleagues, saying, how long are you going to preach wait? How much more indignity, how much more humiliation can we take before it's time to say enough is enough? Because they were saying, don't make trouble. You'll only make it worse for us. Sorry?
That's what the Jews did too.
Yeah. I mean, so King responds to this. So you get used to your slavery. So that's what he's saying. So the Ishbitzer says, look, they had not any arousal to pray, but since God wanted to save them, God roused them in a cry. And that's the beginning of redemption. The beginning of redemption is when you recognize that you're a slave. We'll see in just a minute the Sfas Emet, who's a colleague, a colleague, a fellow Chavrusa of the Ishbitzer. He has this amazing scene. Moses comes to the Israelites, And he says, I've come to liberate you. And they say, from what? And he says, you're slaves. And they say, what? No, we're not. And he says, of course you are. Look at you. You know, you work from dawn till dusk. You get paid nothing. They treat you like dreck, you know. And the Israelites say, shut, don't make trouble. You just make trouble. Don't make trouble. Shh. It's this interesting confrontation. So the first stage of redemption is you have to recognize your situation, but that's painful. When you finally realize that you've been put down, you've been oppressed, when you realize that you're being humiliated, then it hurts. And by the way, then one of the things you want to do is strike back at the person who made you aware of it, right? That's Martin Luther King's problem. He says, you know, I don't want to feel this. I'd rather, the resignation is at least a blanket for me, right? So he says, that's the beginning of red. For before God wants to save, one does not see one's own lack. It's a great question to ask at your Seder tonight. What are we slaves to that we don't know we're slaves to? Because being a slave means not knowing that you're a slave. That's really slavery. Okay? One is unaware of what one has not. But when God wants to save, God shows one the root of one's lack, so that one sees that all the complexity of one's need is rooted in this basic lack, and he gives one the power of prayer, of crying out to God, and one begins to rage to God about it. That's the beginning. So no, before you get to so what's the Ishbitzer's answer to our question, how do I believe in a God of history? The answer is the God of history works through human consciousness. The God of history doesn't split seas. The God of history opens minds. The God of history says to a person, look at you. What's become of you? What's wrong with you? Wake up. Wake up. Look at you. The God of history makes you angry about your circumstances so that you're ready to stand up and demand the dignity that's coming to you. That's how the Ishbitzer understands the answer to the question. The God of history works through human souls. You'll hear the same thing in the next two. The Sfas Emes has this idea that God sends a person who looks like us but acts differently, and that's how they discovered they were slaves. Because Moses was a free man. And they could see in his freedom something that they didn't have, and that's what made them aware. And then the most creative of all of them is the lunatic, the Bratslaver. This guy, mamish a lunatic, right? So here's his idea. You ready? Mitzrayim, which is the word for Egypt in Hebrew. Come in, Reba, guys, come in. Take a seat. Got plenty of chairs. This is a good day to come and find a place to sit. Some days it's not so easy here, but today, thank God, too much charoset. Everybody's. All right, good. Mitzrayim, the Hebrew word Mitzrayim comes from the Hebrew word tsar, meaning narrow. Tsar, tzadik resh. So Mitzrayim, right? In Mitzrayim, the narrowness, da'at, the intimate knowledge and conscious awareness is in exile. Mitzrayim is not a place in Egypt. Mitzrayim is a condition of human consciousness in which your awareness of your own circumstances has become so narrow that you can't see what you can't see. You don't know what you are. You have no idea where you are in the world. It is absent. When any Jew lacks da'at, his awareness of God, his own self-awareness, he falls into spiritual exile under Pharaoh's domain. And once this happens, his actions are no longer governed by spiritual reality. He becomes enslaved by his imagination and illusions, driven to act upon his misconceptions of reality and compulsively live his self-delusion. The labors of his life are spiritually meaningless. Pharaoh, the Hebrew word Pharaoh, the root of Pharaoh in Hebrew, it's not a Hebrew word, it's an Egyptian word. But if you wrote it in Hebrew letters, it's Pei Resh Ayin, which means parua, which means wild. So he interprets that as fantasy. Pharaoh is not a person, Egypt is not a place. Egypt is a condition of consciousness in which you are ruled by your delusions, your illusions, your fantasies, your imagination, and you cease to be ruled by reality. And you pursue those delusions and illusions and destroy yourself in the process. Right? Black Friday. Anyone ever gone to the mall on Black Friday? You should. It's a great experience. I do this every year. It's my pilgrimage. Right? And you see people got up 5 o'clock. You see those pictures on the TV of the people who camped in front of the Best Buy for weeks, right? To get a television set 900 inches wide, right? 100 gazillion pixels. Not as if there's anything on, but you know. Right? And you wonder, like I'm walking through the mall, I'm watching these people buying and buying and buying. And you want to ask them, like, does this make you happy? Will this make you happy? If it makes you happy, Gesundheit. I don't know how you say that in Christmas, but that's but you, Gesundheit, have it, be my guest. But is it really going to make, did last year's possessions make you happy? Right? Like, it's, I mean, it's this pursuit of something because your imagination tells you that if I had X, I'll finally be happy. Or if I am X, I'll finally be happy. So he has this idea that Egypt, the whole drama of the Exodus is not a drama of an historical event that happened a long time ago in the Middle East. What is the drama of the Exodus? It's the drama of a human being coming to consciousness, coming to understand where she or he is in the world. So he believes in a God of history, but the God of history is not the God of splitting seas. The God of history is the God who wakes human beings up to say, oh my God, who am I, where am I, and what am I doing with my life? That's how the Ishbitzer, that's how the Hasidic tradition reconciled this. Okay? Everybody good so far? That was a little bit of an excursus. Everybody breathe, take a breath. So what do we got? We asked the question. How do you believe in a God of history if the world that we live in doesn't resemble the world of the Bible where miracles happen all the time? And we saw that the rabbis asked the same question. They had the same problem. So the rabbis came up with a couple of answers about the world to come, or whether, or this idea of truth being immortal, even though people aren't, or this idea of a halachic framework which mediates the God of history. Then we saw the Hasidic tradition's answer to the question is to basically spiritualize the whole story and make it the liberation of people in all times. It's a drama that takes place within the human heart or the human mind, not a drama which takes place in actual events. Now we come to modernity. How did modern scholars, particular post-Holocaust modern scholars, understand it? How did they answer this? How do you have a Seder after the Holocaust? How do you have a Seder? How do you talk about V'hisha amda lavotenu bayamim? How do you say that? So here are three interesting answers, okay? Ready? So first we'll begin with Mordechai Kaplan, who was Rabbi Schulweiss's teacher, okay? Kaplan, who was a naturalist, meaning he didn't believe in anything supernatural. Right? Religion tends to think of the natural world and the supernatural, right? And the supernatural is a force above nature, and the supernatural intervenes in nature when it needs to. So last night we talked about blood, frogs, gnats, blood, the angel of death going through all that kind of stuff. Kaplan would say, what? Come on. Kaplan would say, you don't believe in that. You're a scientific culture. You understand that the laws of nature apply in all times and all things. Look, if a guy comes to shul this morning and says, you know what? There's a bush burning on my front lawn, and it hasn't burned up, and it told me to do such and such, we would call 911 and get the guy a shot of Haldol, because anyone who gains religious enlightenment through shrubbery is in trouble. I mean, that's a person who's troubled, not a person who's prophetic. Kaplan says, give me a religion I can believe in. But he loves Torah. So what is he going to do with the story of Pesach? So here's Kaplan. I gave you a bunch of it. These are selections taken from his book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish History. Changes have taken place in human life which render the simple version of the Exodus and its meaning no longer adequate. Kaplan insisted on honesty. So let's at least tell the truth, right? Jews have entered into such intimate relation with the life of the world about them that they can no longer envision their own deliverance except as a phase of general human deliverance. So his problem with the Exodus isn't just that he doesn't believe in miracles. His problem is, why would God save us and not save everybody else? It's the chauvinism of the story that bothers him, right? If miracles are to be enacted as part of a future redemption, they cannot be conceived as similar to those with tradition associated with the Exodus. Kaplan did a great thing in his books, by the way. He's not a great writer, but he does this, which I do appreciate. When he gets to a point he wants you to know, you don't have to underline it. He puts it in italics. All right? So all of these italics are in the original. I didn't put them here, okay? The new redemption to which Jews look forward involves the redemption of society in general from its present ills. It implies the transformation of human nature and social institutions through the divine power of intelligence and goodwill. So when we talk about a God of history, what are we talking about? We're talking about progress. We're talking about the redemption of all of humanity, which is going to happen through human efforts, or God working through human beings. That's what we're talking about in the Exodus. So if there is a God of history, that God doesn't intervene from outside. That God works through us. A person who fights for peace, a person who fights for healing, a person who fights for aid for the bereft and the poor. And if you want to say once in a while that sometimes that God reveals himself, Janice is here, so I want to point out to Janice that the dictator of Sudan was overthrown, right? Which means sometimes it takes a while, but God does like some interesting stuff, right? It took how many years? 40. Yeah, right? Janice is important in the life of this man because he once made a comment about her in the United Nations, right? When Rabbi Schulweis and Janice Kaminer-Resnick founded Jewish World Watch and started protesting the treatment of Darfurians, what was his name? Bashir, right? Omar Bashir went to the United Nations and said it is a Jewish Zionist conspiracy to overthrow the government of Sudan. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the Jewish Zionist conspiracy. It's right here. When a vicious, tyrannical, genocidal dictator calls you out at the United Nations, you're doing something right with your life. Right? Right? So there it is. There it is. And this week he was overthrown. Right? Right? So so he says, look, the opening sentence of the Ten Commandments set forth to be sure the claim upon Israel's loyalty to God, mainly by reason of what God did for God's people. The opening words, what God did for God, I lost my place. The opening words of the Ten Commandments imply that in redeeming Israel from Egypt, their God manifested the most characteristic phase of his nature. What's the opening words of the Ten Commandments? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now look, if you were God and you were printing business cards, Lord God, what would it say underneath that? Creator of heaven and earth. Pretty cool, right? Master of life and death. Right? Author of eternity. That's not how God introduces himself. When God shows up on Mount Sinai and hands us his business card, what does it say? Lord God, who redeemed you from Egypt. Why? Because what Kaplan is saying is, we Jews look upon God, and that the most essential feature of God, or godliness, as Rabbi Schulweis would call it, is redeeming the slaves, redeeming the vulnerable, right? That's what we associate with divinity, right? There can be no question that in the Torah, the story of the Exodus has the connotation to help the oppressed is an essential attribute of godhood. It's godly to help the oppressed. That's what the meaning of the Ten Commandments is, says Kaplan. We miss the point of the Exodus epic if the stories of the miracles are merely so many wonder tales that tax our credibility. The contest between Pharaoh and God is a contest between the embodiment of arrogant tyranny on the one hand and the power that makes for redemption on the other. The conception of God as the redeemer of the oppressed has revolutionized the meaning and function of religion and placed it at the service of ethical impulses. It is a mistake to see God as separate and distinct, with man on the one hand enslaved by his physical self, by his fellow man or his tools on the other, God completely transcendent, absolutely free, dispensing the gift of freedom. God as immanent in human life. That's where Kaplan saw God, in the world, acting in the world through us. God as immanent in human life is manifest in the urge to realize to the utmost the highest potentialities of the human being, to the extent that man is unfree The God in man is unredeemed. That's a great sentence. So long as men yearn for freedom and strive to attain it, human life is identified with God and that aspect of the cosmos which spells life and creativity. What do you think? Now you could say, what's the difference between that and secular humanism? I mean, that's the kibbutz Haggadah, right? I lived on kibbutz, and we had a seder on the kibbutz, and they had a whole Haggadah, and the word G-O-D wasn't mentioned once. For them, it was all about the fight for freedom. You're right? The fight for freedom. And that's the secular kibbutz. What? Go online and put kibbutz Haggadah. You'll get many of them. They're beautiful. They're amazing. They're wonderful. They're shocking. Because look what he's done. I mean, he's done something really wonderful. He's given us a completely secular, not secular in the sense, it's transcendent, but it's not supernatural, idea of a God of history. Right? Every time you fight for freedom, you become the God of history. You are enacting the God of history. Right? You are behaving the God of history.
So what's Jewish about that?
What's Jewish? Because our value is, that's what he said here, the value is, right, to help the oppressed, an essential attribute of godhood.
That's not unique to us.
Thank God. That's wonderful. Isn't that wonderful? There are other faith traditions who believe the same thing. They don't have our story. They tell a different story this time of year. You might know that, right? But using our story to essentially articulate that truth, and the fact that other faith traditions might come and work with us, that's just great. Now, you might say, that's not enough. I want something more unique than that. That's fine. All right, so that's one way to answer the question. Everybody get it? Any questions about Kaplan?
Is he the starter of the Reconstructionist?
Yes, he's the
guy.
He's the guy. Right, he's Reconstructionism. Okay. Reconstructionism is an American religious philosophy created by Kaplan and his students in order to give you a religion that people who don't believe in the supernatural can believe in. And you can see what he did to it here. And this is his best book. He wrote about a dozen books. They all say the same thing, but this is the one that says it best. It's called The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. It's Rabbi Kushner, who was also his devoted student, once said to me, he's a great thinker, but he writes with a pen dipped in concrete. Right? It's got no poetry here. And he wrote a Haggadah. Right? And that's a very famous Haggadah. Because in June of 1945, the Aguda, the Orthodox rabbinate, gathered in the McAlpin Hotel in Manhattan and burned his Haggadah in a press conference where they put him into cherem. They excommunicated him. And it was a very sad day because the Second World War had just ended. Nazis were burning Jewish books and Jews all over Europe. And here, a group of Orthodox rabbis burns a Jewish book because they felt it was heretical. Right? The only good thing that came out of that is a young philosophy student by the name of Harold Schulweis read the story in the New York Times and decided this was the man he wanted to study with in order to become a rabbi. And that's how Schulweis came to JTS to study with Kaplan, and they became lifelong friends, he was a lifelong disciple of Kaplan's, and went beyond Kaplan in many ways. But that's how it happened. So turn the page over. Did someone want to make a comment? No. Benny, you're welcome, please. No. It's okay. We got plenty of time. They're doing a full Hallel in the other room, so this is good. Howard, please.
If we did not use God as the reason for getting out of Egypt,
Yeah.
would the Jewish people today be a Jewish people?
That's a great
would we
question.
still be a group if we
That-
told the whole story that it was man that did this?
Okay, great question. Kaplan would put it this way. So Howard's question is, if we took God out of the story and just talked about an ingenious group of slaves snuck out of slavery from Egypt and came to freedom, would we be Jews today? Right? Kaplan doesn't deny God. He just denies a God who lives in the sky. He believes in right, he says that's magical. He believes in a power of, let me put it this way, put it in his language. He believes that there is something transcendent beyond us in the world called a power, sometimes he called it a process for redemption. And that we associate ourselves with that. We're part of that. But it's not outside of us, it's in us. It's the God within. or it's a God that we can connect with within, right? It's the God that allows a slave who can't see freedom as a possibility to suddenly believe that he can be redeemed. It's a God who allows a leader to see that he can accomplish something which he never thought he could accomplish. So that idea of going beyond the self, the ability to transcend my limitations and go beyond the self, that's what Kaplan identifies with God. And that's what he worships at this time of year. That's what he's talking about this time of year. There is that God in the world that is pushing us to identify our responsibilities to the oppressed and our capacity to heal the world. So it's not completely godless. Now, your question is a great question. If you take out a belief in a God who's above and beyond us, what's left of Judaism? Is that a Judaism anybody would want to hold on to? Right? It's a very, very astute...
We stay together because we made a king, we made somebody who would
Yeah.
keep us all together.
Yeah.
Without him, we wouldn't be together.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a wonderful question. If you only worship a God within, is that enough? Is that enough for human beings? Or do human beings need something beyond themselves to believe in, attach themselves to, come to imitate? It's a very, very interesting question, right? At the end of Harold Schulweiss's book, For Those Who Can't Believe, which is Rabbi Schulweiss's theology, his belief, his idea of God, I'll be right with you. He says something very, very astute. The character he's talking to, the whole book is written as a dialogue with a kid named David. He says, David says to me, this all makes sense, but I can't believe it. And Rabbi Schulweiss has a problem. He says, the God that makes sense to me, I can't believe in, and the God I can believe in makes no sense to me. That's the dilemma, right? The God I want to believe in does not fit into my intellectual integrity. And the God that fits my intellectual integrity doesn't move me. I'm not interested in worshiping that God, right? And that's a very interesting observation, that somehow we human beings are, and Rabbi Schulweiss at the end of that book gets very angry at him and says, he's been brainwashed by bad religion. So in my biography of the rabbi, I said, no, this is a generational thing. There's something called postmodern identity, where you can adopt multiple ideas that may be contradictory, but it's okay to have those inconsistencies. And that what the kid is saying to him is that, there's a part of me that responds to myth and mystery, and it's not exactly rational. And I don't want a God that's completely rational. Kaplan was completely rational. And all of us want something different than that, not less, but different than the completely rational or super rational. And that's a balance. And how do you find that? What fits your integrity and is rational at the same time, something that moves you? And it's a very interesting observation.
In other words, we need God.
It may be. Schulweiss sort of admits that at the end of the book, which is so interesting. You write a book called For Those Who Can't Believe. You give him a religion he can believe in, and then at the end of the book you say he still doesn't believe in it. That's such a strange reflection of a rabbi at the end of his career. Right? Yes, please.
If we believe in one,
Speak into the mic so the people at home can hear you.
if we believe in the one God, everybody within, then we cannot communicate with the others. It is not a universal God.
That's true.
While if we do in universal God, everybody has a commonality
Right.
with this. That is the reason for the Jewish life
Right.
and non-Jewish.
Well, so the question is, if you believe in that God, then a religious tradition comes to interpret and offer you a language in which to talk about that God. And you have multiple languages because multiple cultures have offered those interpretations. And can we find commonalities? Can we even find dialogue between and among religious cultures? That's a very, very important question. Very important question, Rabbi. No, come on. I want to hear your thoughts.
All I want to know is which of these answers are your answer. That's all I've
I
ever
haven't
wanted.
finished yet.
I come every week. I want to know your answer. You tell everyone else's answer so brilliantly, by the way,
Yeah, I appreciate
without any doubt, the most brilliant summation of modern theology I've ever heard. And yet, The
You know,
problem.
you've become predictable,
The
Gelman.
problem. The problem is at the very heart of Akiba's death.
Yeah.
And the assumption, which is unquestioned and utterly, utterly false, that Akiba should have been rewarded for his righteous life.
Okay.
We just assume, well, if you're righteous, you get rich, you live long, and you die peacefully in your sleep at 120.
Okay.
Why do we assume that? Why do we assume that? First of all, it's clear that it isn't true. And secondly, if it was true, it would undermine what we believe about God in its core.
Why?
Because if we do mitzvahs to be rewarded, we aren't doing mitzvahs for their own sake. We're doing them for the sake of the reward.
Okay.
Now, a rabbi understood this, a contemporary of Akiba, who, according to Hagiga 14b, in the great story of the four rabbis who entered the Pardes,
Right.
the mysterious garden of mysteries, which I wrote a midrash on, that it was Auschwitz
Right.
that they saw there. And these are the four responses.
Okay.
It was Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Elisha ben Abuya, and Akiba. And the one who understood the defect of our assumptions that we should be rewarded for mitzvah doing was Ben Azai. He and Immanuel Kant later both understood that there is only one reason to do the good, and that is for its own sake. So once we understand that Akiba was doing the mitzvahs not so that he would have a happy life and an easy death, but because they were good. The idea that there should be a reward heaped on the doing of a mitzvah is obscene because it destroys the idea of the mitzvah itself. Or in Kant's terms, it undermines the second version of the categorical imperative to act only on that maxim which one would will to be a universal law of nature.
Okay.
So the point of God, of the God in history, is that there are millions of miracles in the world, and we can see them all the time. The point is we choose not to see them. The rabbinic midrash is beautiful. They say there were people who walked through the Red Sea and they didn't see the walls of water, they didn't see the miracle. And they ask, why was that? And they answer. They say they didn't see the miracle because they never looked up. And so all they saw was mud.
Right.
And all of this is mud.
Right.
All of this is refusing to see miracles. Now, are these miracles connected to goodness? No. They're not connected to we deserve the miracle. The rabbis say, "Ein somchin ala nes." Don't rely on the miracles. They're sprinkled. They're sprinkled in existence.
Okay.
So that people with this infantile idea, I get rewarded because I follow God. What about a new idea? My idea, which happens also to be the truth, which is you do the good because it is the good.
Okay. So now, hold the mic. So.
I had to do that. They do that nowadays. I don't even know what it means.
It means you just broke my $700 microphone. That's what it is. Come back with me to the first page. Come back with me to the first page. I want to show the rabbi that he's right. Okay? I always show the rabbi that he's right. Now, hang on. Look at the Akiba story. Look at where the angels show up, right? The angels show up and say, Zo Torah v'zo schara. This is the man's Torah, and this is how you reward him, right? And they say to him, from the book of Psalms, he should have been those that died by God's hand. And God's answer is curious. What's God's answer? Right? Their portion is in life. This is your idea, right? he did mitzvahs because he loved God, and the reward of a life of loving God is a life of loving God. Mitzvah goreret mitzvah. The mitzvah is its own reward. He got his reward. His reward was to live a holy and precious life. Right? If you want to go beyond that and say, and his Torah goes on after him, that's great. But don't ask me to reward him. That's not why he did the mitzvahs. That's not why anybody does the mitzvahs. Okay, that's true here. Okay, but you have, but what's the burden of the question of the angels? Why did the rabbis ask that question? Zo Torah v'zo schara. Right? And the fact that they're not satisfied with that answer, right? Because we do have an expectation. We do have an expectation. Maybe it's because we were once small children and we expected justice from our parents, right? Right? If I was nice to my little brother, you gave me chocolate milk at supper. Right? We all have this basic expectation that the world should be fair and that there should be a balance. Okay, that's one of the answers. But the idea that it then comes back and says there's portions in the world to come means they weren't totally satisfied with your answer. Because there's something unsatisfying about saying it's a cruel world, live with it. There's something unsatisfying with that. We want something else. So now Kaplan's answer, I think, is not a bad answer, because Kaplan says, you don't like the injustice of the world? Fix it. Don't wait for God to fix it. The part of you that demands to fix it is the God inside of you. That's Kaplan's answer. So it's an activist answer, and it responds to your idea.
Yeah,
okay? No, I appreciate that, right? But I think there is an expectation of somehow we want some justice here. We want some justice here, right? I mean, Pharaoh was destroyed last night because he impressed our people. In fact, there's a midah keneged midah element to this. You threw our babies into the Nile, right? We killed your firstborn. There is a sense in which injustice needs to be punished. That's a basic human impulse, right? Now, you could say, if that's what your expectation is, you're going to live a miserable life because you're going to wait for it and it's never going to come, okay? But I think that's not an unnatural expectation. And the Torah has it also. V'hayim shmo tishma'u. If you pay attention to God's mitzvahs, I'll bring you rain.
Well, that's why God gave us Freud.
Right.
God gave us Freud to get beyond all that.
All right, could be. All right, let's take a look at, I appreciate the rabbi's response. So now we've got two great modern thinkers, right? We have Kaplan and Gelman. Okay.
Not necessarily in that order.
Not necessarily. Chronological. It's chronological. He lived to be 103, so don't, which shows you that God, it shows you that God has a really funny sense of humor. That a guy who denied God all his life lived to be 103. Don't you think that, Look at the next one, Yitz Greenberg. All right, Yitz Greenberg. This Yitz Greenberg has been here many times. He's a wonderful, it's Rabbi Irving Greenberg, Orthodox rabbi. This is the talk he gave here on the occasion of Rabbi Schulweiss's 80th birthday, which ironically is the most clear explanation of his theology, right? So it's a transcript of a talk. That's why it's going to sound a little bit less literary. How can we talk about God again after such an event like the Holocaust? He says we can't. We can't. You can only recreate the image of God. That's a very interesting idea. And if you can recreate the image of God like you can recreate yourself, that is a statement of God's presence. It's a very interesting idea, right? After the Shoah, the Jewish people didn't talk about God. What they did was to recreate the image of God. So think about that for a minute. What he's pointing out, and we'll get to the text of this, is that after the Second World War, something amazing happened. It would have been very natural after the Holocaust for the Jewish people to disappear. Look, a third of us were murdered, 90% of the rabbis in the world, 90% of the Jewish teachers, 90% of the Jewish books in the world were destroyed by the Nazis.
All but one yeshiva.
Yeah. It would have been very natural at the end of the war for the Jewish people to say, enough, genug, it's finished, it's over. Game over. What happened instead? You had this amazing rush of creativity and commitment, right? You had the creation of institutions. God redeems the oppressed, so what did we do? We built the state of Israel and welcomed 3.5 million refugees, right? God God redeems the oppressed, so we fought for Soviet Jews and for Iranian Jews and for Yemenite Jews and for Syrian Jews. Whatever God does, we did. We recreated God's image in the world. We couldn't believe in a God out there, so we became the God we wanted to believe in. That's what he's talking about. The next step for the Jewish people was to take power. I believe, now listen to this statement, I believe God was saying to us, I am not going to save you. This is tzimtzum. That's a Kabbalistic idea of self-limitation of God. Divine self-limitation. I am asking you to stop the Holocaust. You are human. You are a partner in the covenant. Take responsibility. Taking power is the fundamental transformation of our religion now. We can no longer be a religion that says God will save you. God's own message is that you have to take responsibility. If there ever was a time for God to intervene miraculously, it was the Holocaust. So if God didn't do that, he must have intended for us to take responsibility. The Jewish people overwhelmingly understood that. That's why they arose and declared the state of Israel. Before the war, the majority of Reform and Orthodox were anti-Zionists. After the war, overwhelmingly, the Jewish people became Zionists and understood that the taking of power is the only way that you can live, the only way to combat genocide. The establishment of the State of Israel was a turning point for Jewish religion and Jewish history. It was the turning point for all of us. The affirmation that taking of covenantal responsibility, that carrying out the great redemptive act states in the face of contradictory evidence of Auschwitz that hope is not dead, that life is still stronger than death. This statement, the building of Israel, was done by all Jews. So what does he say? Where is the God of history? It's us. If you want to put it in a different, it's the expectation. That God presents an expectation, but it's something we have to do. This is another stage in the covenant. Covenant stage number 1, God redeems us from Egypt. Right? Covenant stage number 2, the temple is destroyed, God gives us Torah, we have to interpret Torah. Covenant stage number 3, after the Holocaust, we have to save ourselves. We are now the God of history. We cannot rely on a God of history to save us. We have to save ourselves. This now becomes the expectation of Jews. That's what makes the state of Israel sacred to us. It's sacred to us because it represents our statement of, number 1, we're not going to disappear after Auschwitz, and number 2, this is how we're going to redeem the world. This is how we're going to redeem the world. It's a very interesting step, very clever, very interesting statement. Yes, Howard.
But it was done by non-religious people.
Yes, isn't that ironic? Give him the mic. Yeah, it was done by non-religious people. That Zionism's principal architects were people who were rebelling against the God of history. Rebelling against it, right? Because the religious said only God can redeem us. The Zionists said no. We have to do this ourselves. We have to do this ourselves. So it's, in this case, the non-religious, the religious rebellion had it right. And that's why it's so interesting that now everybody sees Zionism as an element of everybody except the ridiculously Orthodox, but everybody sees Zionism as an element in their Jewish identity, as a key element in their Jewish identity, because all of us resonate to this idea that taking power and protecting our own and using that power to redeem is an effectuation of what we're all about, of our national ethos. You're right, exactly right. And now Orthodox and Reform have all become Zionists, right? Yes, Brian. Hi.
So we talk about Rabbi
I'm sorry.
Akiva and the reward.
Yeah.
But we didn't define what is the reward because each person has their own reward or what they think is
Olam haba, yeah.
Yeah, well didn't my point was going to be, doesn't Rabbi Akiva actually get his reward, which is the fact that we're here today?
Well, but that's it. So if you go back,
his reward, and everything he had is eternal.
yeah, go back to the text, right? Look at the last line, the fourth answer, right? I said to you before, when you tell a story and you give 4 different endings to the story, it means you're not satisfied with any of them, okay? Right? So Rabbi Gelman's idea that goodness is its own reward is one of the answers. The olam haba, the world to come, is one of the answers, right? That Akiba lived his integrity, that was Billy's idea, is one of the answers. And then you get this last one. On the day that Rabbi Akiba died, Rabbi Yehuda was born. Thanks so much. Which means the man dies, but his truth lives on. And the fact that his truth lives on, that he gains immortality within the community that loves him, right? That's
Chaim.
is another way of understanding his reward. That's a different way of interpreting a God of history.
That's the only reward he would have accepted.
What we say, no, but use that in my terms. So when I read the Haggadah and I talk about a God of history, what I'm talking about is not a God who's going to bring down plagues on bad guys. I'm going to talk about a God who lives within a people to keep alive its perception of truth and its sense of hope. I mean, its sense of, look, it's easy for us to open the door to Elijah. First of all, nothing bad's going to crawl in your house, right? But our ancestors in Europe or in Iran, for those of you from Iran, when your grandparents opened the door for Elijah at the end of the Seder, there's a palpable fear of what might crawl in the house. Well, let's take that more spiritually, right? To say, despite conditions of degradation and humiliation and oppression, I still believe in hope. I still have a sense of hope. Today, by the 19th, yesterday, was the day the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. And they began with a Seder. Because even though the Nazis were about to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto, they still said, I believe in hope, right? The power of hope, of this people to hope, the power of this people to teach an ethic of hope, the power of people to teach an ethic of responsibility to the oppressed under these conditions, that's Akiba's immortality. That's the God of history. That's a different way of understanding the God of history, you see? That's a different way to understand the God of history. Yes, Pop. Go ahead, give him the microphone. If it still works.
If the purpose of Judaism is to redeem the world, so we gave the world monotheism.
Right.
Now we're coming up with new concepts of God. Is this reflected in other religions, so that we will be responsible for giving the world a different view of God?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's reflected in other Western religions that derive from us. You know, but religion is changed and affected by many different conditions. Among them, various forms of tribalism. We have a lot of it ourselves, us, them, right? And when you apply tribalism and you add to it religion, you end up with something quite vicious, right? A divine sanction to do terrible things to other people, right? And that's a problem. So we have to be very careful. That's why Rabbi Schulweis said that religion is the art of the duty to obey and the duty to disobey. You got to know when to disobey. You got to know when to, wait a minute, that's not what God wants. All right, one more answer. Do we have time for one more? David. Wait. Take the microphone so the folks at home can enjoy your genius.
First of all, happy Pesach, everyone, and happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
I wanted to, you just used an expression, and I
Yeah.
don't know if it's something that you'd been contemplating a long time. You said the ethic of hope.
Yeah.
Barack Obama wrote a book called The Audacity of Hope.
Yeah, good name.
Okay, but the ethic of hope is a very deep idea. Okay?
Yeah.
And my mind has been flashing on a scene from a very distant fictional movie called Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff. And there's a very famous scene, who's redeeming who, when Frankenstein is loose in the woods, and the audience is very afraid that he might destroy something, and he hears a violin. And in a hut in the woods, there's a blind man playing the violin. The blind man does not see
Monster.
or fear the monster, and he calms him down.
Right.
And there's no threat. Who's redeeming who in that scene? I
Right.
mean, there's God is playing through that music.
Yeah.
I'm just curious who's the enslaved one?
That's a great question. I mean, that's a wonderful question. So one of the forms of slavery is the loss of hope, right? Because a slave sees no way out. There's no hope, and hope taunts him because if he has hope, it's just going to be destroyed. So you lose hope. But if you lose hope, what do you lose? You lose everything, right? And so if there's nothing else that comes out of these holidays, both ours, by the way, and the Christian holiday tomorrow, it's we don't lose hope. And what's the Israeli national anthem? Od lo avdat tikvatenu. We haven't lost hope. To not lose hope. What happens to a human being who loses hope? You lose a future. You lose your temporality. You only live, with a present and no sense of what might be. It's a very interesting observation, David. It's a very important observation.
I think we all live on hope.
We all live on hope. All right, one more. We got time for one more? This is my teacher, David Hartman. Oh, sorry, Shed. Wait, take the microphone. This means you're broadcast all over the world. Go ahead. Nice to have you home.
Yes. So the part where it says we don't remember what there is to be aware of, and we aren't even aware that we aren't aware.
Yeah, you read that.
Yeah.
That's the Hasidic text, right? The loss of consciousness.
Yes. In the text, it seems like it required a third party to kind of intervene and
Yes.
bring that consciousness to us. But I
Yes.
was wondering if there's any way to bring that consciousness from within us.
That's a great question. Can we awaken our own consciousness? Very hard to do. Takes an extraordinary person. The name of that person is a prophet. What is a prophet? The prophet is the person who has the power to awaken us our conscious, right? Right? I mean, it was very normal for a white man to tell a black woman to get up from the seat, I want to sit down, in a bus in Birmingham, Alabama. Until a black preacher stopped and said, open your eyes and see the degradation, right? It was very common for women to lose their selfhood in this world and to be told to sit down and shut up is a man's world until a movement, led by some very smart people, but very enlightened people, said to women, wake up, you're people, you have a voice, right? It was think about, in our own experience, moments of liberation, when those who have been told that they have no voice and no hope and no power were told to wake up and hear their voice and experience their own power. How does that happen, right? How does it happen? It's a really wonderful question. How do you gain consciousness, right? How do you gain a sense of, oh my God, look what's happened to us, you see? That's a great question, wonderful question. Does it take a third party? Could we do it ourselves? How does it work? And what is it like to be the only one? Moses becomes a very lonely man because everyone tells him he's crazy, right? Everyone tells him he's crazy. If you're the only one, Martin Luther King, today he's a national hero, but at the time he was an anathema, both in the black community and in the white community, right? What is it like to be the only one? The only one. We have the stories of the ones who succeeded, but the ones who didn't lived very lonely lives. It's a very interesting story. David Hartman, real quickly. Ready? We did this article once before. This is the best article he ever wrote. 1983-82, Israel invades Lebanon. And when the United Nations calls out Menachem Begin for trapping Arafat, Begin says, Hitler was trapped in Berlin and we didn't get him. This time we're going to get him. And Hartman objects to the application of the Holocaust imagery to Israel. And he says to us, what is the driving category, the controlling category of contemporary Judaism? Is it going to be the Holocaust, Auschwitz, or is it going to be Mount Sinai, covenant? Are we going to define ourselves because of the Holocaust, or are we going to define ourselves by religious or spiritual obligations out of Sinai? If you define yourself as a Holocaust Jew, you end up with a certain kind of Judaism and a certain kind of Israel. If you define yourself as a Sinai Jew, you end up with a different one. So here's his basic line. We don't have a lot of time, so look at this is my highlight, the bold text. It is important to remember that the Jewish people did not go from the suffering conditions of Egypt directly into the land. They went first to Sinai, made a covenant with God, and pledged absolute allegiance to the commandments. We spent years in the desert casting off the mantle of the suffering slave. After we overcome the humiliating memory of slavery and persecution and understood that we are called to bear witness to God's kingdom and history, only then do we enter the land. The memory of suffering in Egypt was absorbed by this should be covenantal normative demands of Sinai, not conventional. The covenantal normative demands of Sinai. We were taught not to focus on suffering outside of its normative and moral implications. Consider, for example, you have 5 or 6 things on your Seder plate. Only one of them is bitter. Why don't you have 5 plates of maror and only one thing that's... But instead, you only have maror. You only have the bitter herb. Everything else is either sweet or new, or represents life. You do not become absorbed in the narrative of death and slavery. It becomes instead, you transform the narrative of death and slavery into a narrative of liberation. Matzah is, at the beginning of the Seder, halach ma'anya da'achlu avatana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. Matzah is slave bread at the beginning. At the end, it goes through a conversion, a transformation, and becomes the bread of the liberated who didn't have time to let the bread rise. Right? Maror is not eaten alone. It's always eaten with charosed. The bitterness has to be experienced with the sweetness of liberation. Says Hartman, the bitterness is there to remind us that we have obligations to the oppressed of the world. But this has to be absorbed into a way of life, into a way of life. The God of history, we don't worship a God who is going to miraculously, the worship of a God who miraculously liberated us is through our actions in the world. It's through what we do in the world. Through halakha, he would say. It's the actions of the world. So the wise child's question, what are the laws and traditions that God has commanded us, is actually the answer to Hartman. The God of history is mediated through the halakha. The God of history is not is not worshipped independently, because if you worship a God of history independently, you face that horrible question, where was God during the Holocaust? But if you say that I see a God in history every time we're able to create a world or a space in the world which reflects the spiritual values of our people, because we live this lifestyle, we live these spiritual values, well, that's a different way. That's a different way to experience. That's, if you remember, the first answer. The first answer of the Rabbi Akiva's story was, right, happy is Akiva because he died saying Echad. He died the way he lived, right? It's the integrity of that way of life that brings God into the world. So what we have then is a number of reflections of how do you live with that God of history, but all of them understand that these events, for the rabbis, it was the Holocaust of the destruction of the temple, and for modern philosophers, the Holocaust of Europe, that forces us to think about this God in a very different way, and in most of the cases, forces us to respond with a sense of responsibility, with a sense that God is not out there doing miracles, but within, demanding responsibility and a response from within human beings. That's the way modern theology has responded to this. So I wish everybody Hag Sameach, a wonderful Seder tonight. We will be together next week to finish the holiday. Hag Sameach. Shkoyach, thank you. Oy.
Hell of a lot more complicated to get across in an hour in a Seder.
Well, yeah, that's true.